I'm here? Or
Sure.
I want to keep her in the center. It's okay. I want to keep attention on you. And maybe I'll ask maybe one or two questions to get them all going, but then I'd be very happy also to include the others.
Yeah.
She actually had a special request that we keep this session interactive. So we'll try to follow that as much as possible. So first of all, I wanted to talk a little bit about cultural diplomacy. First of all, in the sense of identity, but then also in the sense of a sharing of identity. And I wonder if you could even just say a few words about your own sort of multicultural history in terms of also, when we talk about cultural diplomacy, first we need to understand what is the culture itself. And I think there, I always use the onion analogy and saying our identities are like onions. On the outside, we all look more or less the same. But once you cut that onion in half, you see a very complex layering. That's really unique to each one of us. So I think before we can discuss maybe the cultural diplomacies that you've participated in an exchange, I'd love to talk also about this idea of cultural identity. If you could maybe say a few words about your own identity as you would define it in terms of multiculturalism and beyond.
Identity is a really interesting question, and I think that one of the things that formed me and shaped me even before I was born was the diversity of India, which is a subcontinent, as we know. And so there are parts of India and people in different parts of India that negotiate with each other the way nations would negotiate with each other. There's tremendous cultural differences. And my mother comes from the south and my father comes from the north. And when they wanted to marry, there was, the usual little bit of mistrust on both sides. And on their wedding day, it was really emblematic of how difficult that negotiation can be. Because in the south of India, brides will wear white and people get married in the morning. And in the north of India, widows wear white and people get married at night. And a bride in the north should be wearing pink or red. And in my mother's culture, red is the traditional color of the widow. So there they were, getting married at 10 in the morning because the marriage has to be according to the mother's customs. And my mother was in a white sari, much to the absolute horror of my father's family. And therein began their marriage. A year later, I was to follow, and I was to negotiate with the two of them and their two families all of the mistrust and apprehension that can come from such a union. You know the other, you interact with the other, but you are really not very sure about them. And it took a very long time, my entire youth, for me to see how the two continued to clash, but also, very hopefully, understand each other better and better as time went on. And so it really began at home, in a sense. And I think for many people in India who speak different languages and come from already a multicultural perspective in that sense, one understands that early on. And then a little bit later, I had the opportunity and the enriching experience of understanding what diplomacy can be on a larger scale with somebody from another country, from an altogether different culture than the subcontinent. My mother had a pen friend, which I know in this digital age with Facebook and Twitter, we barely remember what that is. But from the time that she was 15 or 16 years old, she had been exchanging letters once a month with somebody from Austria. And they had never met each other. And by the time I was of the age that I could read, I would be waiting for this letter with a foreign postage stamp to arrive from Austria, and the whole family would, find out what was going on, and my mother's pen friend would send me gifts. She also had a son who was about the same age as me, and when he learned English, he and I started to correspond and write letters to each other. It was sort of taken for granted that I would write to Peter and Peter would write me back. And when I was in 11th grade, my mother sent me on a trip to Austria to visit her friend, sight unseen. She had never met them. She had never met the family. They had exchanged letters, but they had never met. And I arrived there, and I spent 2 weeks there and was shown the country, met their children, and really realized much later, but looking back at that moment, realized that diplomacy is really not about nations, but it's really about human connection between two people who can really know each other. Here, in this case, two families that can really know each other intimately through an exchange. And I had the privilege in India of meeting at that same time when I was in high school, people who had been funded by the United States or by organizations in the United States as students to come on exchange programs, as Americans coming to India. And I was a student meeting them. And they told me so much about the American education system and about a liberal arts education, which they thought, talking to me, that I would be more suited to than an Indian system. And they inspired me to apply for college here. So I was directly interacting with people who were funded by various programs like the Fulbright or by Rotary International to come to India. And I decided that I was going to apply and come here for university. And in a sense, meeting them and interacting with them really changed my life, because this was a day and age when you couldn't just go over the internet and find out how to apply to Harvard. You had to write a letter, you had to wait for a response a month later, and there was one institution run by the United States Educational Foundation, that had that information. So information was really priceless in this age. And all these young people that I met who were ambassadors of goodwill from America to India really served that role, because they changed my life and the life of other students that they met who decided that they wanted to also experience going to a foreign country and seeing what that was like. And very quickly after that, I did apply. I was accepted here, and I went to college here, and I decided that I had this, coming to a different country and living here and experiencing it had completely, had made me an entirely different person. And I wanted other people in India to have that opportunity. And I decided to take a sort of little professional twist in my college years. And I ran, during the summer months, a sort of consulting service of my own for students who wanted to come abroad. So I gave information to Indian students who were looking to come and study in the United States, and ran a sort of little summer thing. And I'm very proud to say that all of them are here now. They all also came. So in a sense, little by little, person by person, sort of lives changed and bridges were crossed, and a new understanding was developed. And it really, for me, that's what I understand by diplomacy and cultural diplomacy. It isn't something that happens because two countries sign an accord and something changes. Signing that accord might mean that things will change for people at the grassroots because they get funding to be able to go and meet, but at the end, it has to happen at that person-to-person level. And all of these experiences that I've talked about, I think, really sort of affected my view of the world, but also made me a dual citizen of two different countries, which I think is very common in today's age, but is also much like a child, either a child of a biracial child or somebody like me who belongs to parents of two different communities. Going forward, you can never choose. And you realize that no matter how difficult the negotiation is, that negotiation has to happen. You don't have to necessarily agree from your different perspectives and accept and adopt each other's culture, but you have to be able to respect it and somehow find a way to work through the differences, and obviously peacefully, because the other person is somebody that you trust and you love, which is the prerequisite to any real understanding.
So I think it's clear your personal experience definitely is, I think, an expression of cultural diplomacy at so many levels. I want to ask you the same question, but focusing more on the professional aspect of your career as a novelist, where really culture can serve as a catalyst for, let's say, some sort of a diplomacy to take place, and sometimes even transcend borders. Traditionally speaking, cultural diplomacy was done by governments.
Right.
In the Cold War, a government would send a Jesuit ambassador, as we heard before, or others abroad. Whereas very often today, I think that this happens very naturally through civil society. Maybe an artist just going and actually having an exhibition, or a piece of literature that actually transcends a border without a government funding it or sending it, etc. So just wanted to ask your own reflections. First of all, maybe how you would define cultural diplomacy yourself, because it's meant very different things in times and spaces. And secondly, how in your professional experience has actually novels or literature also maybe transcended borders and brought people together that normally wouldn't come together?
Yeah, I think I'll take your second question first, because as a novelist, I've had some very interesting experiences. I was writing my second novel when I fell in love with France, and I decided that I wanted to spend some time there, and I started learning French, which at the age of 28 is quite hard to do if you haven't taken grammar classes as a student when you were very young. And I kind of hacked my way through it by watching French movies, and started spending some time in Paris. And subsequently, my work was translated into other European languages, but the French translation was the most meaningful for me because I spoke French, and I spent time promoting my books in France. And I had two different sets of experiences. One was that willy-nilly, whether or not I thought of myself in that way, I wasn't just a writer, I was also representing India everywhere I went, especially since some of my novels do take place in India and talk about Indian politics and Indian life. I was automatically in a position where I was understood to be some kind of ambassador of the country. And a lot of the times when I was interacting with people, I would be in a situation where I had to think not just of what my answer would be, but what is the answer that has to come from somebody who's representing India, which was, as a writer, I'm a fairly sort of independent person. I don't think within these kind of structures, but it was sort of put upon me. And then later this became officialized. There was an Indian delegation that was invited to France of writers, and I was part of that official delegation. There was an official delegation to another conference from India, and I was part of that delegation. And so I found myself slowly transition to a role where, even though I was not in a governmental role, I was in some kind of official capacity representing my country to other people. And at the same time, as a novelist, what you're really, no matter how specific your novel or what you're writing about, art is about transcending that specific situation and somehow being able to reach somebody beyond that specific situation. And so I had a novel called Baby G that is set entirely in India, and the backdrop is Indian politics, and it's about a 16-year-old girl. And I was invited by French students in a French school to talk about it. And I was told by the teachers that they had used this book as an opportunity to enrich their students about Indian culture. And so the students had spent the summer researching different parts of India, and they had put this exhibition together at the end of the summer, which was about India. And so there was a certain level of cultural diplomacy that the teachers were practicing with the students, asking them to really understand and sink into a different culture. And so some of the students had read classic Indian writers like Tagore, others had read contemporary writers like myself, and they had all put this big room together where they had done a lot of work. And they had all written texts that were inspired by the Indian texts that they had written. And these were all French students. Most of them had not left this place. And there was a small town called Montélimar. It's not very big. And it was in their high school. And these students were between 15 and 17. And the teachers had chosen my book because the protagonist of my novel, even though the novel entirely takes place in India, was that age. And the novel has a lot of high school, and it has her, but in India. So they wanted to see how the students are going to relate to it. And it was one of the most incredible experiences of my life, because I got there, I heard them recite their various texts. I saw an exhibition of India where I learned things about India that I did not know from these French students. And then we had a conversation where they talked to me about my book. And even though there was so much, there's Indian, the caste system is there in it, Indian politics is there in it, but what really affected these students and what spoke to them was her sense of being a teenager, her frustrations as a teenager, her sense of being restricted by her parents or not being entirely free or waiting to grow up, and what adolescence is really about. And that's what they were really connecting to. And then, funnily enough, one of them said, "Oh, we've just read this text by Voltaire, and it reminded us of what you have written." And I mean, there's really no, from my perspective, nothing in common. And I think that's when I just was really humbled and understood, even though I've been reading books my whole life and have been changed by them, I think understood in a practical way how art and culture can really transcend. And not just a boundary, but give you a deeper understanding and really allow you to connect with somebody from a totally different point of view and perspective. And so I would say, funnily enough, that in the time as a novelist, when I've, quote unquote, in some sense been a cultural ambassador for India most of the time, and increasingly, I mean, I'm also American and I live here, the moments that have mattered the most are where there's something extremely personal involved. And I think it's outside of the and I think structures are important to the extent that they make that personal moment happen. But that's where their role lies. They're never going to replace that person-to-person connection that I think is absolutely necessary, because understanding can only exist between human beings. It can't exist between entities at the end of the day.
I couldn't agree more. We always say at the Institute, the ability to see yourself through the eyes of someone else can sometimes be really rewarding. I think very often art and expression can give us that possibility.
Right.
You made me think as you were speaking about a French graffiti artist by the name of J.R. Who's very famous for actually illegal art that he does around the world. Most famous on the wall between Israel and Palestine, he actually posted big posters of actually Israelis and Palestinians doing the same jobs. So it'd be an Israeli taxi driver, a Palestinian taxi driver, etc. And it was quite fascinating, not only this exhibition itself, but also the discussions it prompted. He was recounting one story in Ramallah, the center of Ramallah, Palestine, where he was posting, again, I think it was a taxi driver from Palestine and Israel, and to see the reactions of some of the Palestinians initially, what are you doing? He says, I'm doing art, I'm just putting out these posters. And he says, who is it? He says, this is an Israeli and this is a Palestinian. Suddenly there was this silence. This is an Israeli, you're posting there. He'd say, yes. And then he'd wait a minute, he'd say, can you tell me who's who? And they usually couldn't. And exactly those ideas, just to rethink, some of the stereotypes that we are embedded with. So I think it'd be very powerful. The third question I want to ask you as kind of a final question is related also to some of the evolutions that have taken place in the form of literature, so digital technologies. I was walking by Lincoln Center last night, actually, with a friend of mine who's a New Yorker, and I was reminiscing. I said, wasn't there a Barnes & Noble here on the corner before? What happened? And he says, Mark, in New York, people don't read books anymore. They read tablets. And it was just really a fascinating point in the sense things are changing. Do people read books anymore? I was wondering what influence you think digital technologies are having, first of all, on, let's say, cultural expression as a whole, in terms of being a novelist, and secondly, in terms of the way we communicate. Is this having a positive impact, or in your mind, a negative impact on the interactions that maybe could allow for cultural diplomacy to take place? What influences do you see from the digital revolution or digital technologies?
The way we're consuming any kind of content, any cultural content, stories, or even our relationships is more and more digital. We're interacting with people digitally as well, and I think that it really is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, I think it's tremendously powerful. We've seen social revolutions, democratic revolutions happen thanks to social media. We've seen boundaries become absolutely crushed and obliterated for the better thanks to social media. The same kind of information that I, as a student, had to look around for when I was applying to America and really sort of spend 2 or 3 months on, now you can get in 2 seconds, 3 clicks, and you're done. You can learn a foreign language through the digital media. You can really get a tremendous amount of information. But I think the danger is to think that information always leads to understanding, because I think that it could or it could not. And it depends on the intent. And that particular gap between information and understanding is where I think the big challenge is going to be in diplomacy or in real understanding of other people. It's one thing to exchange letters with somebody month after month in Austria, and it's a different thing to have liked them on Facebook and written 3 lines to them and they write 3 lines back to you. There's a difference sometimes in the digital medium in terms of how deep you can go. And there's also the fallacy and the illusion that because it's always there and it's in real time, I wrote this person 1 line and they wrote me back that same second, that there is something deeper going on other than just a simultaneity of events. That doesn't necessarily lead to deeper understanding either. So I think that illusion is extremely powerful. So I think this is a conversation that absolutely needs to happen, and I think everybody should be discussing it, because we can't take for granted what the consequences of this kind of interaction can be. We've not, as a society, evolved over millions of years to interact this way. We've evolved to interact this way in the last 20 years. And that's very fast and rapid shifting change for human society. And therein, I think, there's a lot that we have to unpack, understand, and process about that. And on the same note, the technology has been a tremendous tool for democratic movements, people wanting to have protests, people's protests, activism of every kind. But that same technology is also used by people who want to negotiate difference through violence instead of negotiating the difference through peace. And that we need to remain aware of that. And I think that we're going to really see how we change and how our interactions with each other change through technology in the next 10 or 15 years as it starts to play out. In a sense, it's happened so quickly that I think none of us are really outside it to be able to to see it fully and understand it. I mean, it's great. I am able to Skype my parents who still live in India, and I can see them, and all of the people that I know in France, I can know within a minute what they did yesterday, and I can, feel connected back to them. And those are all tremendous, powerful things. We've, in a sense, the individual has never had this kind of power as we have now, thanks to technology. But on the other hand, I think that there is a great danger of being able to, of the virtual negating or trying to substitute or giving us the feeling that it is as real as the real is. And I think it's not. And we are here today, we are all here in flesh and blood. We are all sitting, everybody is feeling a certain temperature, feeling hot, feeling cold, feeling comfortable, feeling sleepy. But that is all lost when you're on the other side of a screen. And it's better to have that screen than to not have anything at all. But then is it better to, but where do we stop? And so I think I'll end with what I said earlier, which is information doesn't necessarily mean understanding. And what the internet and social media is giving us is information, in a sense. Thank you.